Good evening, Divyajavu. Hello. Trivedi Babu, good evening, one and all. Today we'll discuss something about Australian literature and what is its relevance to Indian literature and why we should read Australian literature as students of English literature. All these things are very relevant because we know that Australian literature is a very large body of literature where we can have translations of Aboriginal songs, folk tales, memoirs, journals, and ballads of early European explorers and settlers. It also includes the more formal works of literature that followed as writing and publishing established its sway on the island continent. Like the literature of any other nation, it captures in many ways the growth and development of Australia into the country that we have today. And as we all know, Australia is also a country under British rule for some time. Like India, Australia was also under British control. And that is why we can say that the colonial rule and the post-colonial assistance are common to all countries that were under British rule or European rule. That is why, as Indians, we share some common link with Australian literature because they had also their oral tradition. The Aboriginal people of Australia uh, were very much rich in oral literature, which have been transformed from generation to generation without having any written document. And after some time, it was recorded in English versions. It was done more with an anthropological intention than a literary one. The idea to learn more about the culture and values of Aboriginal people from a scientific point of view than to study the aesthetic aspects of these creations. Similarly, the records, memoirs, diaries, and journals that are available today also are part of the study of literature And what they constitute is the private or official records of explorers, administrators, and settlers. These works are important sources that reveal how the land, the social and cultural circumstances, and the people of Australia evolved in the thoughts and imagination of the people who lived there or visited it. They show a kind of affinity um, with the Australian people, and they show how Australian literature came to be written and the early influences on this Australian literature. The first thing that comes to our mind regarding Australian literature is the ballads of the convicts and the bush songs, um, which are the earliest versions of the Australian literature that we should begin with. Australian literature began to be a body of literature with periodicals like the Bulletin, uh, published in the year 1880, and the ballads and bush songs, which was the part of the folk tradition, now became the part of literary tradition. Writers began to consciously cultivate and develop the forms, the themes, and the figures of the oral ballads and bush songs. A famous personality called Banjo Patterson belongs to this school of writing. Then Bulging Matilda is a ballad about Swagman, a traveling farm worker in the Australian outback, which has become to many Australians of European descent a kind of introduction or official unofficial document or the national anthem of Australian literature. And these things captures the spirit of surviving in a harsh landscape, the pioneering spirit as well as the bold attitude of life and authorities. Literature in Australia developed and began to take on many other forms, such as the popular short story, the literary version of the Free Side Yarn, Henry Lawson, and Barbara Benton were prominent short story writers who contributed greatly to the growth and development of this genre during this formative stage. Their writing captured features of growth of Australian cultural myths of the bush and its people, the hardships and the spirit of European settlers and the bush people during the pioneering days, which find expression in their work. Now, the year 1898 is very much important as far as Australian literature is concerned. Two famous personalities, Henry Giles Turner, who was a banker and literature, and Alexander Sutherland, a school teacher and journalist, both hailing from Melbourne, published the development of Australian literature. the book called The Development of Australian Literature, this book gives us a general sketch of Australian literature, uh, which consisted of 47 pages to poetry, 30 pages to fiction, and 18 to general literature, which consisted of history, biography, and works of travel and exploration. The bulk of Turner and Sutherland's book, however, consisted of biographies of the three Australian writers whom they thought were of greatest significance: poets Adam Lindsay Gordon and Henry Kendall, and novelist Marcus Clark. These were the three people who uh, formed the iconic status in the book of Turner and Sutherland, The Development of Australian Literature. Turner and Sutherland's privileging of poetry, inclusion of what we would call quote unquote non-fiction, and exclusion of more popular genres like children's writing and drama, established a view of the terrain of Australian literature, which was to hold good for at least the first half of the 20th century. Further introductory accounts were provided by Nettie Palmer in 1924, the American historian and critic Hartley Grattan in 1929, and H.M. Green in 1930. In 1961, Green finally followed up this up by producing his monumental two volume A History of Australian Literature, Pure and Applied. As its title indicates, Green's account was by far the most comprehensive yet to appear, not only discussing the quote unquote pure categories of poetry, fiction, and drama, but a very wide range of quote unquote applied works from newspapers and uh, magazines through to works of philosophy and anthropology. Indeed, for the period it covers 1789 to 1950, Green's is effectively a history of the Australian book and so has proved of continuing value as a work of reference. To bring some order to this immense range of amount of material, Green used period as well as genre divisions. The periods he chose and the names he gave to them reflected the then dominant progressivist model of literary history. So, for Green, to trace the history of Australian literature was to trace an inevitable development from initial conflict of 1789 to 1850 through consolidation 1850 to 1890 and self-conscious nationalism 1890 to 1923 to world consciousness and disillusion 1923 to 1950. In particular, this his decision to begin a new period with 1890 reflected the, the then current emphasis on the 1990s as the period when Australian literature changed from being a colonial to a truly national one. I have already mentioned that Australia was under colonial rule for some time, and the last page, um, that is from 1890 onwards, The true color of national literature of Australia was very prominent. The flourishing period of Australian literature, truly Australian literature rather, came from 1890s onwards. The next substantial critical survey of Australian literature was by Geoffrey Dutton's edited collection of essays, The Literature of Australia, appeared soon after Green's, published by Penguin Books in 1964. It was clearly modeled on the then very popular paperback volumes of the Pelican Guide to English Literature. What the Pelican Guide to English literature served for English literature or British literature. The Literature of Australia, edited by George Geoffrey Dutton, served the same kind of purpose. Coincidentally, however, Dutton's Penguin was also remarkably like Turner and Sutherland's earlier work in its approach to Australian literary history. Some general survey essays giving overviews of Australian history and of fiction and poetry were followed by others mainly on individual authors, as with Turner and Sutherland. Too, there was some privileging of poetry, with 12 out of 22 chapters being devoted to it, as against 7 on fiction and 1 on drama. The poetry was their favored domain, while the survey chapters divided at 1920, a chapter devoted to the bulletin, J. Archibald and A.G. Stephens writing, indicated that the 1890s were still seen as a crucial to the development of national literature of Australia. As an affordable introduction to Australian literature at a time when it was just beginning to be more widely taught in schools and universities, Dutton's Literature of Australia was very popular and which went into uh, a second edition also, which was issued in 1976. The basic structure and many of the chapters remained the same, though changes in the canon of Australian literature over the 12 years. So, chapters on the novelists Christina Street and Martin Boyd and poet Francis Webb replace earlier ones on 19th century poets, 19th century novelists, and poet R.D. Fitzgerald. Lonnie Kramer, whose essay on Henry Handel Richardson had appeared in both editions of Dutton and who had become professor of Australian literature at the University of Sydney in 1968, was the next to plan a history. As editor of the Oxford History of Australian Literature, 1981, she chose a model closer to Green's than to Dutton's, though without Green's period divisions and with a focus on only the pure literary genres of poetry, fiction, and drama. For her, it seems the crucial thing to to establish a reliable canon of major authors to be studied in the then burgeoning discipline of Australian literature. By the 1980s, however, structuralist and post-structuralist theories had begun to have an impact on Australian English departments. So, the Oxford History of Australian Literature received a less then complementary reception in the changing critical and theoretical climate of early 1980s. When Laurie Harthan and others began in the mid 1980s to plan a replacement for Geoffrey Durton's Penguin to be called the Penguin New Literary History of Australia. One of the main problems they faced was how to avoid the elitism of Kramer's history while working with the limitations of both space and time. The work was to be published in the bicentenary year of 1988 that produced the detailed surveys made by Green. Part of the solution was to have a lot of fairly short chapters, some of which would be genre based, some thematic, so allowing a wide and range of material to be covered and to be held together by period divisions which were to be structurally um, and historical rather than explanatory as were Green's. Each period would also have chapters devoted to the then prevailing representations of Australia and Australians and to the particular material circumstances then affecting the production of Australian literature. There were also, as in Doughton's Penguin, a few overview chapters in this case dealing with Australian literature and Australian culture. Aboriginal literature, Australian English, Australian humor, and forms of Australian literary history. In the later period, Peter Price offered melodrama as the term most appropriate to describe the combative quality of Australian literary historiography since the 1950s. Each major new history that is so itself as a taking very different theoretical approach to that of its immediate predecessor. Camus rejected green expansive nationalism. The Penguin history or Penguin new literary history reacted to reacted to the Kramer's elitism.